I'm very happy actually to announce the second seminar in our series, Bridges, which we started with University of Lisbon and my colleague Irene Rodrigues. This is a seminar which is having an overarching theme, transitions. We have two distinguished speakers today, Professor Andrew Kipnis and Professor Gonçalo Santos. We also have two presentations. We have two presentations today. The first one will be titled Ghost Urbanization and Strangers in China and Hong Kong. And the second one will be Chinese Village Life Today, Building Families in an Age of Transition. We start with the presentation of Professor Andrew Kipnis and followed by some of my comments by myself. We can also take one or two questions. I will circulate the link further on, and I think there will be more online audience. Then we continue with presentation by Professor Santos and comments by my colleague Irene Rodrigues, with whom we are organizing these seminars. And we finish with the questions to both speakers. Online or from the audience. I would also like to ask our speakers to give some final comments later. So the first speaker, I would like to present Professor Andrew Kipnis from Chinese University of Hong Kong, who is a professor of anthropology. His research involves social and cultural and political changes in contemporary China. He's currently working on several projects, including one that focuses on the problem of how to dispose of cremains in large East Asian cities. He has recently completed a book that uses the funeral sector as a lens to study, understand urbanization in China, and has previously written books about processes of urbanization in a mid-sized Chinese city, educational desire and governing, the implications for anthropological theory of issues that arise in the governing of socialist states and patterns of gift-giving and social exchange in rural China. From 2006 to 2015, he was co-editor of the China Journal and is currently co-editor of the journal How, Journal of Ethnographic Theory. It's a great pleasure, Andrew, to have you today. And I would like to give you floor now, and you can start the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dennis, for inviting me and for your very kind introduction. And I'm glad to see my old friend Gonçalo, who I think is in Portugal now. And so let me see if I can share my screen here. So is everybody seeing that? Okay. Okay, so I'll begin. In a tiny decrepit apartment in the Hong Kong satellite town of Funling, on the 11th floor, an 86-year-old woman lived alone. Though she had a son and a daughter and several grandchildren, they rarely visited. The son had passed away in his 50s, and the only son of that son, who had been raised by his maternal grandparents, went to university in England. The daughter had married a man in Macau and lived there with her husband and two daughters. One September evening, the old woman fell while trying to change a light bulb. She broke her hip and couldn't move. No one heard her cries for help, and she died slowly over the next 2 days from dehydration. As it was still late summer, the body started to stink the day after she died. Still, no one called the authorities for 3 more days until the stench was truly unbearable. The police arranged for the removal of the body, and her family held a quick and small funeral. A few weeks later, the landlord had the apartment thoroughly cleaned and put up an ad to rent it out again. Many in Funling had heard of the incident and refused to go near the place. But since the old woman's death was not classed as murder or suicide, the apartment was not placed on any of Hong Kong's list for haunted dwellings. Outsiders could not know what had happened there, and the landlord only reduced the rent by 100 Hong Kong dollars a month. The discount was enough to attract a new tenant, a 23-year-old graduate student named Dai Li, who had just arrived from mainland China to start an MPhil program at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. The first night Dai Li slept in the apartment, she dreamt of a blurred image of the old woman's face. She thought little of it, and the next morning she busied herself with buying the last bits of furnishing for her apartment, including some plants to put out on the balcony. She hung a pot of begonias from a hook that extended out of the edge of the balcony that belonged to her upstairs neighbor, so she could look at the flowers and the view of Funling at the same time. But the next night she dreamt of the woman again, and so it went every night, with the woman's face becoming more and more detailed each time. Sometimes the woman would speak to her, asking for a visit. "Why don't you come by? Where are you? How long until you come again?" As the dreams persisted, Dai Li had trouble sleeping and would often wake in the middle of the night. She sometimes got out of bed and went to the balcony to water her plants or look at the moon. One night, the dreams were particularly vivid. Dai Li went to the balcony, but the woman's voice did not stop. "Come visit me. Where are you?" Dai Li climbed a small step ladder to water her begonias. "I'm lonely. You never stop by." Dai Li poured some water into the flower pot. "I need your help now." "Okay," Dai Li replied. She looked out over the edge of the balcony, jumped from the step ladder, and fell 11 floors to her death. This time, the police ruled the death a suicide, and the apartment was listed on all the online registers for haunted apartments in Hong Kong. The landlord had no choice but to discount the rent by 30% and wait for a tenant who did not believe in ghosts. This story is a slightly modified translation of a post from one of Hong Kong's numerous web portals with tales of ghosts, haunting, and unnatural death. I picked this one because it touches on many of the themes of this talk. The old woman is left without family at the end of her life. The young woman whom she haunts into suicide is a complete stranger to her. And Hong Kong's registers for haunted dwellings have a strong influence on the real estate market. Belief in ghosts in contemporary urban China takes an ambiguous form. While few people would explicitly admit to believing in them, many act in ways that imply that ghosts exist. They take special precautions when visiting cemeteries and funeral homes. They say that abandoned buildings feel haunted, and they avoid many forms of talk about and association with death, including not renting or purchasing apartments that are somehow tainted by death. Why? The official view of China's governments would label beliefs in ghosts as a type of feudal superstition, a vestige of a traditional agricultural society, something that is bound to fade away as China urbanizes and modernizes. Today, I am going to take the opposite point of view. I want to explore how ghostly beliefs are tied to the experience of urban living and processes of rapid urbanization. Belief in ghosts in Hong Kong and China may have a long history, but I suspect that such beliefs both transform and deepen during the process of urbanization. Between 2013 and 2019, I conducted research on the funerary industry in urban China, visiting funeral homes and cemeteries in many different locations, with a particular focus on Nanjing and Hong Kong, as well as interviewing people who worked in the sector. And this is a map that shows some of the cities that I visited during my research. So I did spend a lot of time in Nanjing and Hong Kong, obviously, where I am now. But I also traveled around cities. And every time I went to a new city, I would spend a few days there. I would visit the state-run funeral home in all the mainland Chinese cities, visit a few cemeteries, chat up a few people. So it wasn't in-depth research in all those other places, but it did give me quite a feel for sort of the variety of arrangements in different Chinese cities, as well as what they had in common. So I found that funerary practice in urban China differed considerably from that in rural locales. So I had also spent previously a fair amount of time in Chinese villages. In general, rural people appeared to be less afraid of death, dead bodies, and places of burial than urban people. In rural villages, the deceased body is typically kept at home in a coffin, refrigerated these days, for a few days between the death and the funeral. People come by and pay their respects to the body, give a gift, and offer condolences to the family. The funeral itself is organized and conducted by familial elders. After the funeral, the body is either buried intact on village land or first cremated, and then the cremains are buried on village land. In urban China, most people die in hospitals, though death at home is possible. In Hong Kong, I was even told that it was, quote, illegal to die in a public housing estate, as the government wishes to preserve the value of its apartments and they drop every time somebody dies in one. Though I don't see how such a regulation could be enforced. Regardless, as soon as the dead body is discovered, it is removed from the home or the hospital room and taken either to a hospital morgue or directly to the funeral home, where it is stored until the funeral. The funeral is organized and conducted by industry professionals rather than family members. After the funeral, the body is immediately cremated, and the ashes are usually buried in a cemetery in mainland China, or a columbarium in Hong Kong that is located far from the city center and most people's apartments. In rural China, I never heard anyone complain about the fact that their neighbor might be keeping a dead body in their home, and I never heard anybody act as if the fields where they worked every day and their relatives were buried were haunted. In urban China, when I discussed rural practices, most reacted with disgust at the idea that someone in their apartment building might keep a body at home during the period before a funeral, even if it were kept in a refrigerated casket and there was no smell. It was not just that such practice would be illegal, but also that it would bring bad luck and disrepute to all of the people who lived in the building. In some Chinese cities, especially smaller ones, people set up home altars with a picture of the deceased during a few days before the funeral. In very small cities, by Chinese standards, tents to hold funerary activities might even be set up outside of apartment buildings. But in larger cities, such activities are illegal. In the city of Nanjing, where some people set up home altars, others criticized the practice. They said that they found it unneighborly. How dare a family be rude enough to announce that something as inauspicious as a death had happened in their apartment building? Children could have nightmares, and people from other buildings might avoid visiting. Urban funerary professionals will often tell families how to counter the ghastly energy that permeates places like funeral homes and cemeteries. Considered yin in the yin-yang dichotomy, this energy can typically be countered with something yang, such as drinking warm sugary liquids, going to places that are brim with energy and people, like crowded shopping malls, or performing a fire stepping ritual, kuahua, where you step over a fire. In many cemeteries and funeral homes in China, places for stepping over fire are set up near the exit. In one of Shanghai's largest funeral homes, a pavilion with an underground gas fire with a see-through plexiglass cover on top is built into the exitway. I found this surprising because Shanghai is supposedly one of the most, quote, civilized cities in all of China, a place where people are least likely to have any superstitious beliefs, and rituals like fire stepping are often labeled as superstitious. In short, it seems that urban people are more scared of dead bodies, burial places, and even the thought of their neighbors conducting a funeral than rural ones. Throughout China, cemeteries and funeral homes are constantly relocated away from the center of the city. As China has urbanized rapidly, this has required the repeated relocation of state-run funeral homes and crematoria and the digging up of many cemeteries. In Nanjing, when I asked one official why, he said, quote, "People are still afraid of ghosts. The value of real estate near cemeteries and funeral homes is always lower than in the central districts. So, to protect the value of its real estate, the municipal government always attempts to keep funeral homes located far from the city center," unquote. I once told an official in Nanjing's Office of Funerary Regulation about a relative of mine who had his ashes scattered in his favorite park. She replied, quote, "We cannot allow people to dispose of their parents' ashes in public parks. People fear ghosts. One person's ancestors are another's ghosts. People would not like Nanjing's parks if they thought they all had ghosts. So it is illegal to scatter cinerary ashes there, even if they do not pollute the environment and are indistinguishable from the rest of the dirt," unquote. In Hong Kong, I was likewise told that scattering one's parents' ashes in the county parks is illegal. In Hong Kong, places of burial have also progressively moved towards the outskirts of the city. The largest public cemetery is located in Funling, perhaps one of the reasons why the opening ghost story was set there. In Hong Kong, there are 7 licensed funeral parlors, places of businesses that can run funerary services on their property and store dead bodies for the purpose of conducting such rituals, and approximately 120 licensed undertakers who help with funerary arrangements and sell coffins and other funerary paraphernalia, but do not have the facilities to conduct funerals themselves. What is interesting about these businesses is not so much their location, which can be explained by historical factors, their establishment occurring at times when locations that are now central were peripheral, or at transportation hubs that connect easily to cemeteries in peripheral areas, but the conditions of their licensing. Only those undertakers who opened their businesses before the current regulatory regime began in the 2000s can openly advertise the nature of their business, display coffins in their shops, and store crematory remains. These businesses have what are called Type A undertaking licenses. Those with Type B licenses cannot store ashes or display coffins in their store if any other business or homeowners in their vicinity object. Those with Type C licenses are even more restricted. They may not use the word funerary, bini in Mandarin, or buni in Cantonese, in the signs displayed publicly in front of their stores. The logic here is the same as that described by my interviewees in Nanjing. If any neighbor either fears death or dead bodies, or fears that other people's fear could affect the value of their business or property, then this neighbor has the right to restrict the activities of the undertaker. In practice, this means that the business activities of all proprietors with Type B and Type C licenses are affected. For this reason as well, the only funeral parlors in Hong Kong are older ones that established their businesses long ago. The new restrictions on licenses further acts to freeze the business locations of the current funeral parlors and Type A undertakers. If they were to move their businesses, they would face further restrictions, so they remain where they have been historically located. Currently, most of the undertakers with Type A licenses are located in the area of Hong Kong, near the terminus of the East Rail Line. Well, it used to be the terminus of the East Rail Line, which connects to mainland China, and the areas of Hong Kong further areas of Hong Kong furthest from the downtown core. In Hong Kong, many apartment buildings are located in the vicinity of these undertakers. Those apartments which have a window from which one can see an undertaker's shop and the shop sign that says funerary in it, rent for less than apartments which do not feature such a view. In Hong Kong, as the story suggested, there are also internet resources one can use to locate a, quote, haunted dwellings, Hongzak, where unusual deaths have occurred. These apartments, or sometimes even entire apartment buildings, likewise sell and rent for discounted prices. So why are urbanites so afraid of ghosts? 4 factors seem important. First is the increasing separation of life from death in urban contexts. This separation is both a cause and a result of the fear of death. As people die in hospitals instead of at home, as hospitals do all they can to hide dead bodies, and as dead bodies are stored at funeral homes instead of in the home, many people never see a dead body. As animal slaughtering is also removed from urban life, many people rarely even see dead animals. As the cemeteries and funeral homes are moved further and further away from city centers, people rarely go to places where dead bodies are known to be. The less people experience death and dead bodies, the more fearsome it becomes. For many, just mentioning death is an inauspicious form of behavior. Second, and I believe most important, is the rise of a stranger society and economy. Unlike village settings, where those buried in the same vicinity are relatives, in urban cemeteries, strangers are buried side by side. The situation is similar to large apartment buildings where neighbors may not know one another at all. In urban China, at least, the concept of ghost is directly related to the notion of stranger. Kin become ancestors. Strangers become ghosts. Ghosts can do evil and must be feared. They harm anyone who comes into their space. In burial ceremonies at cemeteries in Nanjing, those who conduct the ceremonies often introduce the newly buried to their, quote, neighbors, in the hopes that the spirits buried next door will act in neighborly fashion rather than like ghosts. Urban economies are economies of strangers. We purchase goods and services from those we do not know, and we hope these strangers treat us fairly. Most crucially, in urban settings, funerals themselves are arranged and run by strangers. There are small-scale entrepreneurs called one-stop dragons in China, who, like the Hong Kong undertakers, help families arrange the entire funerary process. There are strangers working in the offices and handling the bodies at the funeral homes and crematoria. There are strangers at the cemeteries, in the hospital morgues, and selling flowers and funerary paraphernalia from stalls in front of cemeteries. Indeed, the funerary industry has expanded so rapidly in China, reflecting its rapid rate of urbanization, that there is even a new educational sector to train workers for this field. As in many places around the world, workers in this sector are stigmatized. They have trouble finding marital partners and often marry each other. They avoid shaking hands with their customers. They lie about their occupation to strangers and tell their children to do the same if anyone asks about their parents' line of work. The stigmatization of funerary sector workers and fear of ghosts in cemeteries are related phenomena. A comparison with sex work is illustrative. A woman who has sex with her husband is an upstanding citizen. A woman who has sex with strangers for money is a polluting figure. A person who helps with the funeral of a relative in a rural setting is a moral person. Those who help with the funerals of strangers for money in urban settings are to be shunned. Burying ancestors is an act of filial duty. Burying strangers and dealing with their ghosts exposes one to pollution. Because they are stigmatized, both sex work and funerary work can be relatively lucrative forms of employment. Both sectors cross uncomfortable lines between domains of the familial and the monetized economies of strangers. The third and related factor behind the fear of ghosts in urban settings is the idealization of family. As China urbanizes and modernizes, not only does contact with strangers become more prevalent, but the size of families and households also shrink. Rather than the entire social world being composed of relatives of varying degrees of distance, as was the case in much of rural China 100 years ago, the social universe is composed of a few close relatives and a larger society of strangers and acquaintances. As the size of one's family shrinks, the contrast between kin and non-kin becomes more important. Family becomes idealized as a site of moral interaction, while the world of strangers is where one might face exploitation, robbery, and treachery. Dead strangers are ghosts that might harm you. Dead relatives are ancestors that can only help you. Here it is important to note how ideas about ghosts in China transform as China urbanizes. It is in urban and urbanizing China that ghosts are equated with strangers. In traditional rural Chinese society, ghosts were often thought of as relatives or kin who had been mistreated in life and not given a proper burial. The whole purpose of a funeral was to make sure that one's dead relatives became an ancestor instead of a ghost. When one's social universe is comprised almost entirely by family, then both good and evil must be located within the family. In urban settings, families can be imagined as good and strangers evil. The transformation in family that go along with urbanization can also be seen in the way that dead children are memorialized. In rural China 100 years ago, dead infants, toddlers, and young children were not given any funerals at all. Their bodies were tossed into ditches and fields for animals to consume. They were often thought of as evil spirits, ghosts of a sort, that had invaded a particular woman's womb and who would return again if given a proper burial. But in contemporary urban China, losing a child is one of the most painful things imaginable. Dead children can receive elaborate funerals, and children's tombs are often the most ornate of all. Dead children represent only the love of their family and are never associated with evil spirits. Family is sacred, while ghosts and strangers are dangerous. Urban ghost stories, like the one I told at the start of this talk, reflect these transformations. As families shrink, some people end up with no families at all. They are abandoned and can become ghosts when they die. Once they are ghosts, however, they tend to haunt specific places and cause harm to the strangers who happen to go there. In Hong Kong, stories about abandoned elderly who die in their tiny apartments in public housing estates are not rare at all. No one even notices their death until the stench becomes unbearable and the authorities are called in to investigate. After their death, the entire housing estate might be haunted. Though the ghost's death was caused by familial abandonment, the people the ghost harms are strangers. The ghost might cause accidents or lead new occupants of their former apartments to commit murder or suicide. In such stories, the fear of familial neglect and the fear of strangers join together. The final factor related to urban ghosts are the existence of abandoned, often derelict buildings, neighborhoods, and factories. These were places that once brimmed with life, but because they are slated for urban renewal, or because the economic basis for their thriving has faded away, they are now empty. The decaying buildings relate to entire communities or entire ways of life that have been abandoned, just like the elderly in Hong Kong's housing estates. If someone dies during the period when the abandonment occurs, they may become a lonely and abject ghost who lingers in the empty buildings, taking revenge on whoever enters. There is necessarily a political aspect to this haunting, as abandoned communities may have protested or may have attempted to protest before their destruction. Once, in a small Chinese city, I asked some students to tell me about places that were said to be haunted. They directed me to a group of abandoned buildings slated for destruction on the edge of their campus. When I visited the buildings, I saw no one. I walked behind them where a low wall marked the edge of the campus and separated its territory from a construction site where another group of buildings had recently been torn down and new ones were only partially constructed. On the wall, I was shocked to see the following graffiti. It could be translated as a 4-line poem. Greedy desire, contradiction and selfishness, falsehood and mediocrity. Is this a great heaven on earth? However one translates these lines, they are obviously an outpouring of political discontent. Such forms of expression are strictly policed in China. So I can only assume that no one with any connection to officialdom had visited the place for a long time. A chicken and egg problem emerges. Is it the case that the site's purported haunting inhibited visitation, which allowed the graffiti artist to get away with such a subversive tag? Or was the tag itself what was haunting the site? In today's Hong Kong, the political protests of the past year have given rise, or past few years ago now, have given rise to another form of haunting. Subway stations where violent incidents occurred, for example, are said to be haunted. Students murdered by the police become ghosts. Such haunting might be thought of as having a double source. On the one hand, like the abandoned elderly, or those who are murdered or driven to suicide, people killed in acts of political violence are likely to become unsettled ghosts. On the other hand, the ongoing political repression of actively memorializing, remembering, or giving voice to the spirits of these dead victims transforms them into ghosts. Ghosts are not only strangers, but also someone or something that should not be remembered, at least in the eyes of some authority figure. Since memories of them are repressed, these spirits must actively haunt the living to receive recognition. In sum, I would like to suggest that ghosts and haunting in urban China are not a form of belief that exists as a rapidly disappearing vestige of a traditional rural past, but are rather produced in the process of urbanization itself. The separation of life from death, the rise of stranger sociality, the idealization of family and its separation from the wider society, and the constant disruption of communities of living and production, and the repression of their memory, all contributes to the haunting of urban China. And so thank you very much. And I'll just put in a plug for my book so you can read more about these stories in this book. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Today we have another distinguished anthropologist with us, which happens to be Gonçalo Santos. Gonçalo is a Portuguese anthropologist, as me, and he is based in Coimbra, University of Coimbra now, where he had started his studies in anthropology. He went to China after finishing his BA, and he has been writing on China and Chinese rural societies and other subjects concerning especially family. Since then, I believe Gonçalo has studied Chinese languages, in fact, Cantonese and Mandarin, and he has done field work for 2 years in this village, which is in the north of Guangdong province, and from whom he has returned several times in the past 20 years. And he has been working in different universities. I've been following you in Germany, in England before, and lately before he has come back to Portugal in the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Today, Gonçalo will talk about Chinese village life today, building families in an age of transition, which is, I'm expecting, part of his book on the subject, recently published. And he gets back to the field work he has done in this village to think about issues concerning not only the family life and the challenges of family life in China, but also the technocratic and techno-scientific advances and how that influence the decisions and challenges people have to face, many of them moral ones. So I will give the floor to Gonçalo. You can have a very clear idea of Gonçalo's work. He has published different books and articles, very interesting ones. So other than this book, I invite you to check a little bit more on Gonçalo's work. Thank you for being with us, Gonçalo. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Irene, and thank you, Dennis. It's really a pleasure to be here, giving this talk in virtually in Macau. Macau for me was really where everything started back in the 90s when I set out from London, from the London School of Economics to Macau to learn Cantonese back in 1995. And I had two books in my backpack, so to speak. One was Peasant Life in China, and the other one was Xiang Tu Zhongguo, From the Soil, both from the great Chinese anthropologist Fei Xiaotong. And of course, at that time, still in the 90s, when China was pretty much closed to the outside world, still to a large extent, rural China still dominated the paradigms to think about a China that was, one has to say, the moment one crossed the border to the other side, be it Shenzhen or Zhuhai, was in a great urban transformation. It was in a great transformation. I mean, the slides here from the city of Shenzhen in the 1980s compared to 2010s, I suppose they speak for themselves. And we kind of moved from the 1990s to now to a situation where much of the former influence of Fei Xiaotong and the focus on rural China has sort of faded away, to the point that now, given that the urban population is much larger already, 60% of the population than the rural population, then, we've been talking recurrently since the early 2000s about fading rural China, disappearing rural China, pretty much like in the previous talk when Andy Kipnis was talking about, fading traditions of fading traditional beliefs in ghosts. I mean, we've been talking about those. Supposedly that's what modernization does. The book that I published in last year, drawing on 2 decades of fieldwork in rural areas, kind of takes a different approach to this kind of fading, disappearing rural China, rather than adopting a kind of what I call a hydraulic model of urban-rural division, whereby the increase of one leads to decrease of the other. I adopt a more relational approach, meaning that rather than talking about the end of rural China, I'm more interested in asking the question of how is rural China being transformed in the context of shifting rural-urban relations. The theoretical framework of the book therefore adopts a sort of relational approach to the rural-urban divide with, of course, an emphasis on the rural perspective. This is very important because most studies of urbanization in China since the 90s tend to adopt the urban perspective. That is, what is happening to, what is, for example, rural to urban migration doing to the cities? Much of the people in the rural community that I'm working on has been engaging in rural to urban migration, but I'm asking the reverse question. What is rural to urban migration doing to rural areas? As Irene mentioned earlier, the approach that I'm developing is longitudinal. That means that I didn't just go once to a village and hang out there for a couple of months, maybe even a couple of years. I kept on returning. And I kept on returning for about 2 decades, speaking also the language that people speak, which is not really Mandarin, it's Cantonese, or a local version of Cantonese. So the fieldwork is multi-sited in the sense that, you know, I move on, I follow people where they take me. So they go to the city, I go to the city with them. They set up vegetable gardens in peripheral areas in big cities like Guangzhou, I follow them. So it's multi-sited. And I'm also taking into account the intersection between global developments and national and local developments. Our global developments affect, in other words, national projects of modernization as they are implemented at the local level. I still find useful to talk about transitions. It's like the word that every social scientist likes to criticize, but we can't really do away with. It's important to talk about transition, and we've been talking about transitions when it comes to China. Probably the most influential paradigm to talk about what's been happening in China since the 1980s is the post-socialist transition kind of paradigm, you know, to see how China sort of got integrated in the global capitalist system as it sort of engaged increasingly with transnational forces of marketization and privatization. In the book, I'm talking about a different kind of transition. It's a transition that probably we are more very familiar nowadays, especially after 2 years of COVID-19 pandemic. It's the role, it's a transition that talks about the increasing role of scientific knowledge in everyday life governance. And I think we live in an age in which we are witnessing the increasing reach of technocratic frameworks of everyday life governance. These frameworks are globalized in the sense that they are quite often promoted by global intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations and so on and so forth, but they also have a local dimension, pretty much like responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, followed WHO recommendations in many ways, but it also revealed many sort of local specificities when we look at each context. It's multi-dimensional. It's multidimensional, this transition. It affects just about any aspect of everyday life, from birth to death. Each chapter of the book focuses on a different aspect of this technocratic transition, which I do not, of course, conceptualize as a unilinear process. It allows for many of the recombinant transformations that Andy talks about in his beautiful book on urbanization. In chapter 1, I talk about, the impact of technocratic projects of regulating population movements in the lives of local rural communities in Guangdong province. In chapter 2, I look at the family planning policies. In chapter 3, the reorganization of the management of the process of childbirth. In chapter 4, I look at child rearing and parenting. Chapter 5, at the arrival of flush toilets in the countryside and the reinvention of public sanitation. And chapter 6, I look at popular religion. I would have loved, Andy, to have a chapter on that, actually. And I do have some interesting materials on that, but we cannot talk about everything. Anyway, to dominant theoretical frameworks to think about the technocratic transition in China. So on the one hand, we have those following the likes of anthropologist Yan Yunxiang talking about individualization. Basically, the formula is state-led scientific modernization plus marketization equals individualization. So we've been talking about what's been happening to China in the last decades, focusing more on the individual agency side of things. On the other side of, we have approaches following Foucauldian approaches, largely following the likes of anthropologist Susan Greenhalgh, who has been talking about how nation building and state coercion remain strong, but they also increasingly rely on powerful expert, meaning scientific discourses and governing rationalities, meaning that the governance of everyday life increasingly relies on this sort of technocratic frameworks of governance that are based still on powerful state organizations, but that also increasingly involve multiple organizational frameworks. In the book, I adopt an ethnocratic approach to technocratic governance, sort of in between the two approaches that I previously outlined. And I focus on marginal rural communities, communities that do not really have a voice in present-day public discourses on what's happening in China. And I asked the question, how do specific communities mediate the impact of larger forces of technocratic governance? So the focus is on negotiations, how larger forces of governance get translated into context-specific frameworks of practice, affect, and meaning. These translations, I argue, are particularly visible when we look at communities in the margin, because their beliefs are bound to be very different from the ones that are being enforced by expert discourses embedded in public policies. Theoretical inspirations from anthropology, approaches that have been focusing on the utility, the usefulness of focusing on communities living in the margins of northern cultures of technocratic modernization. And of course, STS approaches, they've been highlighting a crucial tension at the heart of contemporary technocracies. And I think we live in an age in which this tension is more than ever important. On the one hand, the desire to rely on science and technology to protect society. And on the other hand, the desire to monitor, to check out the role of experts, to reclaim technocratic governance to society and protect the interests of the vulnerable. I'm going to talk to you about one example of this. One entry point to this technocratic transition is what happened to childbirth in China. I mean, childbirth attempts to modernize childbirth in China have surely over 100 years. The first reformist ambitions start to be developed in the late 19th century. And in the first decades of the 20th century, you have the first policies to actively modernize and bring childbirth under medical supervision and to hospitals. But it's not before the 1950s, after the foundation of the People's Republic, really, that we really start to have an expanded program of medical modernization with clear-cut rural-urban distinctions. In 1979, a few years after the beginning of reform and opening in China, the birth planning policy starts to promote or makes mandatory hospital births. But at this stage, as you would expect, hospital birth rates are still quite low. And we're talking about hospital birth rates below 50% of the population. It's really from the 1990s onwards that we have an exponential increase as the technocratic transition accelerates, as the technocratic medicalization accelerates, under the influence of international programs set out by the United Nations, like the Safe Motherhood, and also the Millennium Goals Significant amounts of money were poured onto the development of maternal health care facilities. And by the 2010s, the target is reached. And the goal was to reach universal hospital births with the idea of reducing mortality rates, maternal and infant mortality rates. There was, of course, an unforeseen effect, and that was excessive medicalization, too much, too soon. High rates of unnecessary medical interventions, high rates of cesarean deliveries. Why childbirth? Why did I get interested in childbirth of all topics? Well, I said before that I've been developing fieldwork in a small village. When I got to the village in the 1990s, the first time, 1999, childbirth was a hot topic. The birth planning policy was becoming more and more strong in the area. People were giving birth in secret locations. And I was puzzled by what was happening. In my innocent ideas about childbirth, I thought about childbirth as something so intimate and private. And it turned out to be that I was learning a lesson of social sciences. There's nothing more political than childbirth, than family matters, right? As I stayed on in the village with repeated visits to the, to that part of rural China, people who I met in 99 that were children, they grew up, they themselves started to have children. So I had the opportunity to witness dramatic transformations in childbirth practices over the decades. In the 90s, home births dominated still. They were attended by village midwives, as I said, quite often in secret locations, very low rates of medically assisted hospital births. And after the 2000s, we started to shift, to witness in the area a shift to universal hospital births. Anthropologists call this kind of model of childbirth management that is that comes across, or that is defined, or that unfolds as a kind of a cascade of obstetric interventions, one after the other, technocratic births, right? So the rise of technocratic births in this part of China was really after the turn of the millennium. And of course, between 2010, 2018, there was a tremendous explosion of cesarean births, 40% rate between 2010 to 2018. This was a nationwide phenomenon, what I was encountering in rural areas. The surge in China started in the 90s in more affluent urban areas, and it then eventually expanded to rural areas. Now it's growing at a faster rate in rural areas than it is in urban areas. In 1993, we had a rate of 4.9%. By 2002, estimates point to 20.4%. In 2004, 2008, according to an influential article published by WHO, China had a cesarean rate, one of the highest in the world, 46%, well above the 10 to 15% levels recommended by the WHO. Above 10 to 15%, there is no evidence pointing to beneficial healthcare results for mothers or infants, right? So quite the contrary, there is growing evidence that rates of cesarean above 15% lead to more healthcare hazards to both mothers and infants. Of course, Beijing responded to WHO, and it implemented or tried to implement a system of cesarean quotas. Okay, so many hospitals in China, public hospitals, have systems of cesarean quotas. Did it work? Not really. Evidence is quite clear. The latest evidence published points to between 2008 to 2014, an average of 32.7, 2012 to 2018, above 30% still. Some other statistics point to 35%. A data set that I have from a hospital in the city of Guangzhou with over 30,000 deliveries in 2017 had more than, had close to 40% cesarean rates. A data set that was analyzed by myself in Zhejiang. Anyway, from the anthropology, we can have some interesting ideas to make sense of the cesarean surge in China. I mean, of course, it didn't come out of the blue, and it wasn't just a product of individual choice, meaning that women asked for cesareans, but it was shaped by a political economy. I mean, anthropologists have pointed out that global medical capitalism leads to technocratic medicalization. Birth starts to be managed as a cascade of obstetric interventions that often culminates in surgical interventions. Two key factors: the privileging of obstetric knowledge favors cesareans, the commodification of births favors cesareans. The way it happened in China had some specificities. The project of technocratic medicalization of births in China was shaped by authoritarian policies. First, the birth control policy, and then United Nations sponsored projects of attempts to reduce mortality rates. So hospital births are mandatory in China, and most women continue to give birth in public hospitals. But of course, as you would expect from the literature, from the anthropology of birth, cesareans have become a major source of revenue for hospitals. They quite often represent double, sometimes triple income when compared to vaginal delivery, vaginal delivery revenue. Pregnant women, of course, have some freedom to express preferences as reproductive consumers. I mean, we're talking, of course, of a market-oriented economy, but choice of birth method is not an individual right. Medical doctors need to justify cesarean procedures, and cesarean consent forms are required. Family members have to sign cesarean consent forms. Okay. So in the book, I approach birth choices as intimate choices. And that means that I have to not just talk about mothers in the abstract, I have to locate mothers in specific contexts. And I have to approach birth choices as negotiations that involve not just the mother and the doctor, right, the usual suspects, but also the mother's family and her entourage, her community. So I focus on negotiations. That's the negotiations and translations. You know, how do policies get translated in conversations within amongst these various actors? And of course, these translations vary from context to context. And I'm interested in looking at the moral frictions that quite often emerge in these negotiations. One of the questions I had over the course of longitudinal fieldwork was, you know, as cesareans become routinized, they become more common, you know, what kinds of moral tensions are emerging between women as they get to discuss what is the ideal, what is the desirable form of childbirth? Do these tensions have an important generational component given the rapidity of the cesarean surge in rural areas? Just to give you an idea of the kinds of stories that I've encountered, you know, let me tell you a story about Lisa, you know, whose first son was born in 2012. Lisa was born in the late 80s. She married in the late 2000s, right? Her first son was in 2012. Her first daughter was in 2016. This is the story of the birth of her first son. These stories are bloody. So if you're sensitive, you might want to step back a little bit. Lisa started to have contractions in the morning, right? And at 2 p.m., she went to the local rural clinic, accompanied by her mother-in-law and the mother of this last one, an experienced village midwife. At 3 p.m., 1 hour later, she was checked by the doctor. The doctor recommends an emergency cesarean on the grounds that the cervix was not sufficiently dilated and the girl seemed to be feeling too weak to go through the pain of natural birth. The doctor urges the mother-in-law to sign the consent form and agree the payment. The mother-in-law is not happy with the cesarean recommendation and then there's a sort of a dispute between the doctor and the experienced village midwife. Okay, eventually the doctor is really very, very angry to the point that he says that he's going to refuse to take any responsibility if anything goes wrong during vaginal delivery. Eventually at 5 p.m., the baby boy is born naturally. So, you know, it's a vaginal delivery contrary to what the doctor recommended. I want to draw a diagram here. It's a diagram about childbirth negotiations take place in China, you know, and it's a diagram that needs to be taken into consideration for anybody thinking about childbirth. So we have negotiations with three actors. We have doctors, we have the pregnant woman, we have the family. You know, it's a wonderful triangle that needs to be taken into account if you have to make sense of childbirth in China. And I'm particularly interested in making sense of these negotiations from the perspective of women, because in reality, in rural areas in particular, childbirth network or networks of childbirth support are gynocentric. Gynocentric means woman-centered. Right? The majority of, most women continue to be surrounded by other women as they prepare for childbirth. The key source of advice that they receive on childbirth matters continues to come from experienced female relatives, such as mothers-in-law. So if you want to understand what's going on in the negotiations within the family, you have to understand what are the different positions between these different generations of women, because the ideals of childbirth of young women are being mediated by these gendered intergenerational conversations. So I adopted a sort of a longitudinal ethnographic approach to what is happening to childbirth in China and to the routinization of cesarean procedures in rural areas, interviewing over 60 village mothers of different generations, you know, individually in focus groups, focusing on their various experience. I focused on two different generations. The older generation was born in the Mao area. They have, in average, 4 or more children, so lots of childbirth experience, right? And they were the last generation to experience home births attended by village midwives. As you move on to the younger generation, it could not be more different. The younger generation born in the reform area, they have less children, 2 or 3, and it was the first generation to give birth in the hospital under increasingly medicalized and technologized procedures. See, as you would expect, I found significant generational differences, 2 kinds of differences. I mean, not just different experiences of birth, but also different registers, frameworks, generational frameworks of moral evaluation of the trend towards high rates of cesarean deliveries. The younger generation, they continue to value traditional ideologies celebrating the virtues of vaginal delivery, but they say that childbirth is dangerous and must be managed by obstetric doctors. Being modern is to deliver in the hospital and be subject to obstetric supervision. Cesarean deliveries should only be performed under emergency conditions, even though mothers within this generation disagree over what counts as an emergency. 40% of all young mothers had cesarean delivery. None of these cesareans was pre-scheduled. They were emergency cesareans. And the main reasons indicating the cesarean were inability to cope with the pain of vaginal delivery, perception that vaginal deliveries involve significant risks for newborns, concerns with bodily shape, including the shape of the pelvis and the uterus, so aesthetic considerations, desire to stay in the hospital longer to get some rest from family duties. The younger generation, the older generation, by contrast, says that, well, scientific medicine did help women give birth more safely, but excessive medical supervision and intervention is not good. Women, they say, are becoming too soft. If we could deliver babies at home without any medical assistance, why can't the younger generation handle a vaginal delivery in the safety of the hospital? Women, they say, are not vulnerable beings. They are strong and have the capacity to endure the pain of birth through self-reliance. Strong concerns with the well-being of the family. Cesareans are too costly and place an unnecessary burden on the family. They are also very suspicious of medical doctors. They are greedy. They want to make money. They are self-interested. We see here moral double bind, I would say. On the one hand, you have the drive to be modern and be subject to technocratic medicalization for the sake of safety and risk management. On the other hand, the drive to be natural, handle the pain, to be traditional, and avoid unnecessary medical intervention. I think this moral double bind is placing irreconcilable demands on pregnant women. But it also allows for some flexibility. I mean, you can have a high-tech birth in a hospital, right, with all kinds of medical intervention, at the same time refer to your experience as a traditional vaginal delivery. We're witnessing as well changing ideals of childbirth. The traditional ethical system based on earlier non-interventionist models derived from traditional Chinese medicine, also on socialist ideologies of work and endurance, and the idea that a good mother has to be able to endure the pain of vaginal delivery. The emerging ethical system suggests that a good mother should try to endure the pain of natural birth, but only if there are no biomedical risks involved for the baby and the mother. Having the moral responsibility to handle birth is too burdensome. Better to delegate the responsibility to the medical doctor. Birth is not just about medical safety. There are other considerations: level of pain, physical hardship, health risks, impact on bodily shape of mother, and so on and so forth. So why are these intergenerational moral tensions important? I mean, I would say that understanding the moral conversations that are going on between different generations of women within, pregnant women's gynocentric networks of childbirth support is crucial, because we have to make sense of what's happening to childbirth from the perspective of pregnant women and their communities themselves, right? If we want to develop new public policies that are capable of reducing cesarean births, cesarean rates, and protecting the well-being of pregnant women, and also taking into consideration the points of view of women and their communities, I mean, we have to make sense of these moral conversations, especially because recent technocratic efforts to reduce cesarean rates with cesarean quotas are not being effective. In fact, they are creating new uncertainties, Some colleagues, Susan Greenhalgh and Jiang Li, in a recent edited volume, ask can science and technology save China, commenting on the dominant model of technocratic modernization of the party. And we can ask the question, have science and technology saved Chinese women from the dangers of childbirth? I mean, on the one hand, we can say, yes, they did. Sure, the move to the hospital was an important step forward. I mean, mortality rates effectively were reduced, but it has also created new tensions. And I think that these tensions have to do with the emphasis on one-size-fits-all technocratic solutions that do not pay sufficient attention to the perspectives of pregnant women and their communities. The net result of this is that we have increasing uncertainties for pregnant women. We also have various forms of obstetric violence, including unwanted cesarean procedures, or quite often refused cesarean procedures to fulfill by medical doctors wanting to fulfill cesarean quotas. I think China needs a new paradigm of childbirth care. The technocratic paradigm, authoritarian policies prevail. The goal is to achieve certain targets, certain numeric targets, targets of population control, targets of mortality rate reduction. We privilege only one form of knowledge, obstetric knowledge, only one form of equipment, biomedical equipment. The result of this is excessive medicalization. And then we use further technofixes to reduce the negative effects of excessive medicalization with little success. We need a new paradigm, a more holistic approach that takes into account the perspective of pregnant women and their communities. And to develop this knowledge about this perspective, we need more ethnographic work being done on births, ethnographic work being done by anthropologists and social scientists. The new paradigm also needs to be more open to non-obstetric forms of knowledge. Midwives, doulas that were literally eliminated from the delivery room, right? The focus should not be on quantity, achieving numeric targets, right? It should be on quality of care, including women's well-being. This was all fine until 2019. And there were increasing discussions, amongst various quarters in the internet forums, also growing numbers of organizations promoting alternative forms of birth and so on and so forth. But COVID-19 has brought in a profound crisis and disruption that we are still sort of unraveling now. I mean, I haven't been to China since 2019. So, but, I would expect that in the same way that childbirth procedures and practices were disrupted in many other parts of the world, and that this disruption led to a certain reinforcement of, prevailing technocratic paradigms of childbirth management. I would expect that to have happened to a nation that has entered into a state of emergency, a state of crisis, a COVID-19 zero policy, in which clearly the priorities are not the well-being neither of patients, much less of pregnant women. Thank you very much.